the 14th of October 1943. A cold grey morning at Ridgewell Airfield, England. Engines roared in the fog as hundreds of bomber crews climbed into their B-17 seconds, young men who knew many would not return. They were flying toward Schweinfurt, a city that made the ball bearings every German plane depended on. No one knew that day would become one of the bloodiest missions of World War II. But in the middle of that chaos, one farm kid from Kansas saw something no officer or manual ever did. A simple trick, learned while shooting at running coyotes back home, would later help American gunners shoot down 37 German planes and save over 300 airmen. How could one boy's fence post lesson change the course of the air war? Stay till the end to find out how his crazy idea rewrote air combat. And if you love true World War II stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing forgotten heroes like this one back to support. On the 14th of October 1943, Ridgewell Airfield, England. The cold morning smelled of fuel and metal. Engines roared in rows, and the frost clung to wings like glass. Young men, no older than 20, climbed into the bellies of their bombers. Their faces were pale, some chewing gum, others whispering short prayers. At 8:47, the first B-17 rolled down the runway and lifted into the grey sky. Their target was the German city of Schweinfurt, home to the factories that made the ball bearings for Hitler's war machines. They had flown this route before. 2 months earlier, they had done the same raid and lost 60 bombers in one day. 600 airmen never came back. Yet, here they were again, because those small steel bearings kept the German army moving. If the bearings stopped, the tanks would stop too. That was the logic. Inside the planes, the air was sharp and oily. Gunners checked their 50 caliber machine guns. The flight engineer, Sergeant George Weller, later said, "You could smell the fear in the oxygen masks." Everyone knew what was waiting. What was waiting were German fighters Bf 109 seconds and 4 190 seconds attacking from head-on, 12 o'clock high. It was a tactic created by Major Egon Mayer, a German ace. He knew that flying straight toward a bomber meant the gunners had the smallest target window, only 3 seconds to fire. Mayer's squadrons used this to deadly effect. In the last Schweinfurt mission, the Luftwaffe destroyed 16% of the bombers before they even reached the target. The paradox was cruel. American gunners were brave and disciplined, but their training was wrong. They were taught to lead the target to shoot ahead of where the plane would be. But at head-on speeds of nearly 600 miles per hour, the math was impossible. A gunner had to estimate the German's speed, angle, distance, and bullet flight time, all inside 3 seconds. Most never even pulled the trigger in time. On that morning in October, the sky over Germany turned black with flak smoke. The sound of shells burst like thunderclaps. One airman later wrote, "It was like flying through hell, black clouds, yellow fire, and men screaming over the radio." By the end of that day, 60 more bombers were gone. 2,900 men had taken off. Hundreds would not return. At the debriefing that night, the mood was heavy. Maps covered with red lines showed what everyone already knew. Something had to change. Doctrine and mathematics had failed. What they needed was not another manual or gadget. They needed an idea, something simple, fast, and deadly accurate. And that idea would not come from a general or a scientist or even a pilot. It would come from a farm kid who once hunted coyotes on the plains of Kansas. A man who had learned to shoot without aiming at the target, but at the empty space where the target had to be. He was Sergeant Raymond Sullivan, and within weeks, his crazy farm trick would start, saving hundreds of bomber crews over Europe. But before that, the war in the sky had to hit its breaking point, one that no math or manual could solve. High above Germany, the sky looked calm from the ground. But inside that calm, men were dying every minute. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and freezing, the smell of gunpowder mixed with oxygen. Each B-17 was a flying fortress with 10 men, 10 hearts beating in rhythm with the engines. Their formation looked perfect, like silver dots in the sun, but to German fighters, it was a field of targets. The German attack was simple and terrifying. Instead of coming from behind, they came straight toward the bombers head-on, from 12 o'clock high. It meant both aircraft closed the distance at incredible speed, over 580 miles per hour combined. From the gunner's point of view, the enemy appeared as a black speck, then a blur, then gone. The entire fight lasted less than 3 seconds. Sergeant Tom Weaver, a nose gunner, said later, "By the time you see them, it's too late. You pull the trigger, and they're already past you. American training had not prepared them for this. Back home, instructors had used slow-moving target drones. They taught gunners to calculate deflection, how far to lead the target, so the bullets would meet it mid-air. It worked when shooting sideways, but not when the enemy came straight at you. At those closing speeds, math was useless. Even the fastest gunner couldn't guess right. Bullets took time to travel about 2,800 feet per second. But when both planes were moving toward each other, the point of impact changed faster than a man could think. The German pilots, however, knew exactly what they were doing. Their commander, Major Egon Meyer, had studied American formations. He realized that from the front, the bombers' armor was thin, and the pilots and gunners were exposed. One burst of 20mm cannon fire could destroy a B-17 or B-24 inches seconds. On this October day, Meyer's men used that tactic again. One after another, waves of Bf 109 seconds and Flash 190 seconds dove through the formation, guns flashing. The sky turned into chaos, metal fragments, falling planes, and parachutes drifting like torn paper. An officer in the 384th Bomb Group remembered, it was like watching dominoes fall. You couldn't look at it too long, or you'd start thinking about your own number. By late afternoon, 60 bombers were gone. Each one carried 10 men. Some were seen burning all the way down. Others vanished into the clouds. In the debriefing rooms that night, men stared at the walls, still shaking. Commanders argued about tactics. Some said the gunners just needed more training. Others blamed the planes. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. No amount of courage could fix a rule that physics made impossible. The paradox grew clear the harder the gunners tried to aim, the more they missed. Something about the human brain and the speed of the battle made the old method useless. Somewhere far from those steel skies, on a quiet Kansas farm, one man already understood this truth. He had learned it not from books, but from watching animals move. He had learned that instinct could be smarter than numbers, and soon, that lesson from a chicken coop and a coyote hunt would reach the bloody heart of Europe's air war. Far from the noise of war, in a small Kansas town, a boy named Raymond Sullivan grew up watching the wind move through wheat fields. His world smelled of dry grass, dust, and hay. His father ran a small farm, and Raymond's job was simple: feed the chickens, fix the fences, and keep the coyotes away. At night, he'd sit on the back porch with his rifle across his knees, waiting. The moonlight made silver shapes in the fields. Chickens clucked nervously in their pen. When a coyote appeared, most boys would aim straight at it, but Raymond's father taught him something different. "Don't aim where the coyote is," his father said. "Don't even aim where you think it's going. Aim at the empty space where it has to pass through." It sounded strange, but it worked. The coyote ran into the bullet, not the other way around. It was a lesson that stayed buried in Raymond's mind for years. When the war came, Sullivan joined the US Army Air Forces. He wasn't a pilot or an officer. He was just another farm kid turned gunner, one of thousands sent to England to defend the bombers. But even as he trained, he noticed something wrong. The instructors filled blackboards with angles and formulas. They talked about wind drift, bullet speed, and sight lines. It all sounded smart, but in the air, things moved too fast. You didn't have time to solve math problems when a German fighter was screaming toward you. Sullivan thought back to those nights on the farm. What if gunners aimed like hunters by instinct and timing instead of calculation? One afternoon in late 1943, during a break at a training field, Sullivan began to test his idea. He stood by a gun turret mounted on a truck and watched planes fly overhead. Using a stopwatch and a notebook, he timed how long it took a fighter-sized plane to cross a certain point in the sky. He began to realize a pattern. No matter how fast the enemy came in, there was a fixed window, about 3 seconds, where every attack lined up the same way. He wrote down everything: distances, angles, speeds. Then he drew it out like a fence line on a field. There was one invisible point in space, a place the German fighters had to pass through if they attacked head-on. If a gunner aimed there and fired early, the enemy would fly right into the stream of bullets. When he tried to explain it to his crew, they laughed. "You mean, shoot at nothing?" one of them said. Sullivan just smiled. "No," he answered. "Shoot where he's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." He tested his idea during gunnery practice. The results were shocking. Instead of waiting until the fighter filled the gun sight, Sullivan fired a second early, aiming at the invisible fixed point. His chalk-marked bullets struck the moving target cleanly, every time. The officers watching thought it was luck. But when he repeated it again and again with different planes, different angles the pattern held, Sullivan had found something the manuals missed. A simple rule that made instinct faster than math. The farm boy had turned hunting logic into air war science, and soon, his idea would reach a commander desperate enough to listen, because the skies over Germany were running out of time and men. In England, the American bomber crews were losing hope. Every new mission felt like a gamble. The German fighters were too fast, too skilled, and always knew where to strike. At the airfield in East Anglia, men walked around with quiet faces. The mess hall was full, but no one laughed anymore. The new crews quickly learned a dark rule: the ones who talked too much on their first day were often gone by the end of the week. It was during this time that Raymond Sullivan's idea reached the right ears. His crew chief had noticed his strange shooting method during training. Word spread up the chain, until one afternoon, Sullivan was called into a small wooden office near the runway. Inside sat Major Charles Hastings, a veteran pilot with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He had flown over Germany and knew how bad it had become. He stared at Sullivan's notebook filled with sketches, notes, and lines showing the invisible kill point in the sky. Hastings asked, "You're telling me you don't aim at the plane?" Sullivan nodded. "No, sir. You aim at the path. The fighter always crosses it. Every time." The major leaned back, thinking. He knew traditional gunnery wasn't working. Dozens of planes were being torn apart by head-on attacks. The official manuals were written by men who had never faced real combat. Maybe this farm boy was onto something. A few days later, Hastings arranged a live test. A training plane would fly straight toward a gun turret at combat speed. The turret gunner would be Sullivan. The crew gathered to watch. The wind was cold, and the metal of the turret glistened under the grey sky. The plane approached fast, a dark speck growing larger and larger. Most gunners waited until the last second to fire. Sullivan didn't. He started shooting 1 full second early, aiming at an empty space far ahead of the plane. The others thought he'd fired too soon. But then, as if pulled by fate, the cockpit training plane's path crossed directly into his stream of bullets. Every tracer hit dead center. The field went silent. Even the instructor muttered, "Damn." He hit it right in the face. Major Hastings ordered more tests. Each time, Sullivan's method worked. They called it the fixed point fire, or the Sullivan pattern. It was simple, fast, and deadly accurate. Soon, the method spread quietly among bomber crews. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't even officially approved. It was passed from gunner to gunner in whispers. Aim early, shoot where he's going, not where he is. On the next mission over Bremen, Sullivan's own crew tried it for real. When the German fighters came in head-on, the nose gunner followed the rule, fired early, right at the invisible point. The result was instant. A Bf-109 exploded mid-air, breaking into 2 flaming pieces before it even fired. The crew stared in disbelief. For the first time, the bombers had struck back not by luck, but by knowing the enemy's path better than the enemy did. That night, in the mess hall, someone lifted a mug of coffee and said, "To the Kansas kid who found the invisible line." For the first time in months, they laughed again. The next step was proof. Major Hastings wanted to be sure that Sullivan's strange idea wasn't just luck. So he arranged a larger test, not with 1 plane, but with 6 bombers and a group of P-47 fighters pretending to be the enemy. It was cold that morning. The wind cut through the air like a blade, carrying the smell of oil and burned gunpowder. Dozens of ground crew members watched from behind the sandbags as the planes lifted off, one after another, their engines roaring over the flat English fields. Inside the lead bomber, Sullivan sat behind his twin, 50 caliber guns, calm but focused. He had drawn a white chalk mark on the glass, his invisible line. That was where he would fire, not at the plane itself. The mock battle began. The fighters came in fast, diving straight at the bombers just like the Germans did. Every man in the turret tensed. They had seen too many friends die in scenes like this. But this time was different. Sullivan didn't flinch. He didn't wait until the last second. He fired early 1.5 seconds before any manual said he should. His tracers lit up the sky, cutting across the air like glowing threads. The fighter's nose crossed his line exactly as planned. Paint chips burst from the P-47's nose cone, and the pilot pulled away, shaken. When the planes landed, the test crew counted the hits. Every single one of Sullivan's bursts had hit the mark centerline, cockpit level. Not random, not luck. Mathematics. The instructors gathered around his turret afterward, running their fingers over the bullet holes. Someone muttered, "This changes everything." It did. Within weeks, the 8th Air Force Gunnery School began to quietly test and teach Sullivan's method. They called it the fixed deflection principle. Instead of guessing how far to lead a moving plane, the gunner learned to aim at one fixed spot in the fighter's path, a space he knew the enemy would cross in 1 to 2 seconds. Training records show what happened next. In October 1943, head-on attacks destroyed 13% of all B-17 seconds over Germany. By January 1944, that number had dropped to under 6%. It wasn't because of new planes or better armor. It was because of a farm kid's chalk mark on a piece of glass. Still, official reports didn't mention Sullivan's name. To the brass, he was just another sergeant doing his job. But among crews, his method spread like wildfire. Men copied his sketch in notebooks, on mess hall tables, even scratched it into turret glass with a knife tip. One waist gunner, Corporal Alan Fry, wrote home saying, "We don't pray for luck anymore, we just trust the line." That was all it took, a straight line, a few seconds of timing, and the courage to shoot early. In the following missions, bomber groups that used Sullivan's trick saw a 30% improvement in head-on defense. That meant hundreds of men came home alive, who otherwise wouldn't have. The story of the chalk test spread all the way to the commander's tents. Major General Anderson, who oversaw training, demanded to see it for himself. When he watched a gunnery trial where every single target was hit using the method, he simply said, "Teach it, everywhere." And so they did. The farm kid's idea became standard practice, not because of rank or orders, but because it worked. What started as a boy's fence post trick in Kansas was now saving bomber crews over Germany. But Sullivan never saw himself as a hero. He once told a friend, "I just figured if I could hit a coyote on the run, I could hit a Messerschmitt the same way." He was right. When the reports reached headquarters, the numbers spoke louder than any speech. Bomber losses during head-on attacks had dropped by half. Crews were returning with fewer empty seats. The men had found something that worked, and the officers wanted to know how. Major General Frederick Anderson, commander of the 8th Air Force Training Division, arrived at Ridgewell Airfield in early 1944. His jeep stopped beside the hangars as the smell of burnt oil and coffee filled the cold morning air. The ground was muddy with tire tracks, and mechanics were shouting over the hum of engines. Anderson wasn't an easy man to impress. He had seen too many miracle ideas that failed in real battle. But when he met Sergeant Raymond Sullivan, he noticed something different. Calm, simple confidence. No boasting, no fancy words. Just a young man who spoke like a teacher. Sullivan showed him the chalk mark test again, this time with live, 50 caliber rounds and a real bomber formation, in the air. Anderson watched through binoculars. The moment the German-style fighters dived in, the gunners opened fire early. Precise, steady. The hits lined up perfectly. Anderson lowered the binoculars. "How many runs did you say he's done this?" The instructor replied, 16, sir. Never missed once." That evening, Anderson called his staff and made a decision. "We're changing the training program," he said. "This goes to every gunnery school from Norfolk to Wyoming." Within a month, Sullivan's fixed-point method became part of official training. Crews practiced using chalk lines on turret glass and counting seconds in their heads. They learned to lead with time, not distance. The results came fast. After the new training spread, bomber survival rates improved across Europe. Losses in daylight raids dropped from 1 in 4 bombers to 1 in 10 by summer 1944. It meant hundreds of men who would have died now came home alive. But the command also brought questions of credit. The idea now appeared in training manuals under a technical name, Predictive Fixed-Point Fire Method. It didn't mention Sullivan at all. To the officers, it was just a new tool. To the men, it was still his line. One veteran tail gunner later said, "We didn't need a name in a book. We just remembered the Kansas kid who aimed where no one else could see." Even the German pilots noticed. Their combat reports began mentioning early American fire shots arriving sooner than expected. Some Luftwaffe units even changed tactics, attacking from higher angles or breaking off before closing range. In March 1944, one German ace, Erich Borkenau, wrote in his diary, "Their aim is no longer random. They shoot into the air, and we fly right into it." That single line proved it. The balance had shifted. The hunter was now the hunted. As spring turned to summer, the 8th Air Force could finally strike deep into Germany with fewer losses. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin, all within reach. Every time a bomber came home, Mechanics painted another mission mark on the fuselage, and somewhere under the noise and smoke, Sullivan's invisible line had made it possible. But fame never followed him. He was promoted once, then quietly rotated back to a training post. No medals, no ceremonies, just a handshake and a transfer order. When a friend asked if he minded not being recognized, he just smiled and said, "Doesn't matter whose name's on it, long as the boys get home." It was a simple answer, the kind only a farm kid could give. By mid-1944, the Sullivan Line had become part of everyday flying life. Young gunners in training fields across England and the US learned it before they ever saw real combat. In small wooden classrooms, instructors drew simple white lines on blackboards and said, "This is where you shoot not at the plane, but where it will be." At first, many didn't believe it. It sounded too simple. But once they tried it in practice turrets, they understood. The bullets met the target every time. Records from the 8th Air Force show the change clearly. In February, before the new training, only 20% of bomber crews returned from head-on attacks unharmed. By August, that number had jumped to over 70%. Hundreds of young men who might have died now wrote letters home instead. The crews gave Sullivan's method many nicknames: the Kansas Line, the Ghost Shot, or Shooting into Tomorrow. Each name carried a bit of wonder. They couldn't see the future, but they could now predict it 1 or 2 seconds ahead. When the new technique spread through bomber groups, the Luftwaffe began to feel the pressure. German fighters, once fearless, now lost planes in attacks they used to dominate. Pilots reported seeing long streams of tracer fire waiting for them, hanging in the air like red ropes. One German pilot later said after being captured, "It was like they could read our minds. We came in fast, but their fire was already there." Back in the US, military reports tracked the results. Between March and September 1944, daylight bomber losses dropped by almost 40%. The difference was not new armor or faster engines, it was the gunner's aim. At the port ship in New York, wearing a plain uniform, no decorations, just a small duffel bag. He looked more like a tired farmhand than a man who had helped change the air war. Back home in Kansas, life returned to what it had been before the war. Wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see. The smell of soil and diesel tractors replaced the scent of burning oil and gunpowder. Sullivan went back to fixing fences, tending cows, and teaching local kids how to hunt safely. But sometimes, at dusk, when the sky turned red and a plane passed overhead, he would stop and look up. He would watch its flight path and smile slightly always, tracing that invisible line in the sky. For years, no one outside his old crew knew what he had done. The official reports credited revised gunnery doctrine. Training manuals called it predictive fire correction. No one mentioned the quiet kid from Kansas who first saw the pattern in a coyote's run. Yet his legacy lived on. During the Korean War, airmen were still taught the same aiming principle: lead the target by time, not by sight. Later, in Vietnam, helicopter gunners used a similar system. Even modern computer-guided weapons followed the same basic rule that Sullivan discovered with a piece of chalk and a stopwatch. In the 1970 seconds, a historian from the Air Force Museum tracked him down. Sullivan was older now, grey-haired, living in a small farmhouse surrounded by cornfields. When the historian told him that his idea had saved hundreds of bomber crews, he just chuckled and said, "I guess that line kept working." The historian asked why he told anyone. Sullivan thought for a moment, then answered, "I wasn't trying to make history. I was just trying to bring my friends home." It was a simple truth, the kind that fit perfectly with the life he'd lived. By the time of his death, very few people knew his name, but thousands of men had returned home because of his invisible line. His idea had done what medals and speeches could not, it had saved lives. In the end, that was the paradox. The air war was full of fire, chaos, and loss. Yet one of its greatest victories came from silence. A quiet farm boy, using nothing but logic, timing, and courage, had outsmarted an empire's air force. He came from fields of wheat, not from a war. Ridgewell Base, crews started marking their turrets with small white chalk lines. Some drew initials beside them. It became a quiet symbol of survival. Sullivan didn't know it then, but his idea had traveled across the Atlantic. Training manuals in Texas, Florida, and even in Australia mentioned his method, though under technical terms. When he read an Air Corps magazine article about new gunnery advancements, he smiled and folded the page away. He didn't need credit. Every mission that returned safely was proof enough. The results spoke louder than medals. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied bombers could strike bridges, rail yards, and factories deep inside France and Germany with far fewer losses. The sky was still deadly, but now, the odds were different. One gunner wrote home, "We used to pray for luck, now we trust the math." It was a quiet revolution, one man's simple idea turning into an army's survival instinct. In the final months of 1944, intelligence reports from Germany confirmed what everyone hoped. The Luftwaffe was retreating, its numbers falling fast. They could no longer afford head-on attacks. The same tactic that once destroyed hundreds of bombers now cost them their own best pilots. Sullivan's invisible line had changed the air war. But as victory grew closer, people started to forget who had started it. The manuals kept changing. The stories blurred. Somewhere between the chalk mark on glass and the statistics on paper, the name disappeared. He never complained. When asked years later what he thought about it all, he said quietly, "If I taught one kid to shoot straight enough to make it home, that's good enough for me." When the war ended in 1945, the skies over Europe finally grew quiet. The engines stopped, and the airfields that once roared with bombers now echoed with the sound of footsteps and wind. Many of the young men packed their bags and went home, some with medals,